Welcome to everyone join us for the Samuel Lawrence Foundation's First Friday series. This episode today is dedicated to addressing the critical issue of housing in the United States. I'm Lance Gould, and I am the CEO of Brooklyn Story Lab. Join us today as we unpack the American housing crisis, exploring systemic inequality, policy hurdles, and economic pressures, and diving into solutions for ensuring safe, stable housing for all. Our panelists, who span legal advocacy, grassroots activism, and policy making, will reveal the challenges and opportunities in making housing a human right. With that, I'll turn this over to our moderator for today, Taylor Moore, the program director of the Samuel Lawrence Foundation. Take it away, Taylor.
Thank you so much, Lance. And as all of us gather here today to talk about the housing crisis, I think it's also really impossible to ignore what's been going on in LA with the devastating wildfires that have recently swept through. And these fires have destroyed homes. They've displaced, countless people and families. And I think this serves as, frankly, a really stark reminder of how vulnerable our housing systems are in the first place, especially in the face of climate change. Natural disasters like these fires only worsen and deepen housing insecurity, and it really highlights the urgent need that we have for affordable housing, for sustainable housing, and for all over resilient housing solutions. And beyond just the immediate devastation of these fires, it makes us think of broader issues too, right? Like I mentioned, the lack of affordable housing, the rise across the US in the criminalization of homelessness, and the general growing inequality and access to safe shelter. But today we're fortunate to be joined by an incredible set of panelists who bring a lot of diverse expertise to this conversation. We have Tamara Ezer, who is a legal scholar specializing in human rights frameworks. We have Rob Robinson, who is an activist and an advocate for the global housing movement. And we have Senator Catherine Blakespear, who is a California state senator who is leading policy efforts on housing reform. Unfortunately, we were supposed to be joined by another special guest today, Ms. Jessie Spear, who is actually the co-founder of the Samuel Lawrence Foundation. She's unable to join us, but nevertheless, I think we're going to have a wonderful conversation. And so with that, we can go ahead and dive right in. And the first kind of question that I want to pose to everyone here may seem obvious, but I think for our listeners and our viewers, it's something important to dive into. So I'm just going to go ahead and ask, is housing a human right? And maybe I'll hand this over to you first, Tamar, and anyone else who would like to speak to this.
Great. Thank you so much, Taylor. It is such a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I also to say I'm coming in from Miami. I teach at the law school at the University of Miami. But I'm originally from LA, so I want to really echo Taylor's words, and my heart really goes out to everyone in Los Angeles that's currently struggling after the wildfires. And so responding to this question, I want to talk a little bit about international human rights law as well as the situation in the US. And I want to talk about so under international law, let me start this way. Under international human rights law, there is a right to housing, but I want to talk about what that means and what it doesn't mean. So common misconception, it doesn't mean that there's a right to housing free of charge, but what it does mean is it requires governments to take steps to ensure all people can house themselves in peace, security, and dignity. It also is beyond just a right to shelter. As we were talking a little bit beforehand, just the group of us, and a right to housing is not the same thing as shelter. Right to housing requires housing that is adequate, and under international law, there are 7 dimensions of adequacy, which cover everything from affordability, accessibility, habitability, security, having that you don't have to worry about a forced eviction, and cultural adequacy. So there are 7 different dimensions. Now, the US has traditionally not recognized housing as a human right. However, we have had some positive small steps during the Biden administration. And in fact, I think we were all very pleased when Biden was running for presidency. He ran on a platform that specifically recognized a right to housing. And under that administration, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness noted that it believes that housing should be treated as a human right. Now, we're, of course, in a different administration, so we shall see, and I think we have some troubles ahead. But there's really interesting, very active, very exciting work at local and state level for advocacy to recognize housing as a human right, including in California. There's a very active coalition that's been introducing an amendment to the California Constitution every year, committed to introducing it to recognize housing as a human right, and including in Connecticut and Vermont, in New York. So there's very exciting local and state advocacy to be involved in for housing as a human right. I'll just say one last thing. Although the US has been reluctant to recognize housing or social and economic rights in general, like right to housing, food, health care, as rights, there is recognition of the need for equality in all of these issues. And for housing, is a place that we've seen a lot of disparities, both racial disparities as well as a gender dimension, where about 57% of women experiencing homelessness is a direct result of domestic violence. And that is something that the US has traditionally taken very seriously. Thanks so much for starting us off, Taylor.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Tamar. All incredibly important points. And that actually perfectly brings me to my next question. You mentioned, a lot of these movements that are happening across the US right now and efforts. And so I'd love to hear more about, when it comes to these movements, what are the barriers in place here? What are the systemic and political barriers to addressing homelessness and addressing the housing insecurity? And so anyone who would like to take this, maybe Senator Blakespear
Yes.
or Rob.
I'm happy to jump in here. So thank you so much, Lance and Taylor, for hosting me. And I'm really honored to be on this panel with these esteemed other panelists. So I really appreciate the opportunity. I think one of the, and in a way, the answer to this jumps off of the last question about housing as a human right. The barriers are really around our collective understanding of whether we owe people housing that would be built by the government or provided by the government in some way. And I think our biggest barrier is that we do not collectively seem to feel that way. Housing is a commodity, so it's largely built by the private market, and there are some various incentives and tax credits and options for a certain small percentage, 10 or 15%, to be affordable, so deed restricted affordable. But most housing that's built is market rate housing, and essentially it's a trickle down theory of older housing stock is more affordable, housing will trickle into affordability. We have a Section 8 voucher program, which is the main way that we provide housing for people who are lower income. And then we have this enormously complex patchwork of shelters and interim housing and permanent supportive housing and veterans and LGBTQ and formerly incarcerated and a whole bunch of different areas that are filled by counties, nonprofits, cities, advocacy groups. And all of that creates the system we have, which is essentially not working well. So I think we see, like in the California state budget, we fund almost 50% of our budget is schools. So we see schooling as much more of a human right than we do housing. Our housing budget we have to fight for every year. So it's not guaranteed. It's not something that can be relied upon as a year-to-year funding stream. But public schooling is something that we do invest in. And so I think the massive change that would be needed in a state, California is the fifth largest economy, but we still are not, I would say we are not on the brink of turning the corner. We're doing a lot of things around the edges, which incrementally may end up making a difference, but the reality is every single month more people become homeless than leave homelessness, and that number grows every single month for years now, and I don't see that that's changing. And then you add on wildfires or other things that lead to mass displacement at the same time, and it becomes much worse. So and then the one thing I'll just say in conclusion is that we need the federal government to really invest in this and care, because it has to be done at scale. And the Section 8 voucher program has been the most effective program for housing after we eliminated public housing. But I really think we need to consider going back to public housing. I mean, it needs to be high quality, but we need to get over the siting problems. We need to buy the land. We need to site it like barracks or dormitories are built, lickety split when we care to. And it's like, are we, do we care about this so that people don't live in a tent outside, or underneath a bridge or in a doorway or in a canyon, that they're actually living inside where people can build an actual home and a life.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm curious to hear Tamara or Rob if either of you have any thoughts on the senator's idea of public housing.
Yeah, if I could jump in here, I do think, for many years, public housing was considered a true social safety net for people in this country, and it worked. But then our government abandoned it. It went to systemic disinvestment and ended up with public housing disappearing from the landscape in many cities. The city where I live, it hasn't disappeared. A combination of things. One, 500,000 people live there, so it's another city. Where are you going to put that city? I think the second thing is that there's been a robust struggle from social movements to push back and to keep public housing public. But it's a challenge. But I agree with the senator that our government needs to invest in it. We can't rely on the private market. And I was smiling as the senator was talking because I said, I hope this conversation goes to economics because it speaks a lot to we rely on the market. The market is not going to work. But I'll tell you something, the senator will understand budgets. I live in a city where the city says it does a great job of providing shelter for people to the tune of $3 billion a year to temporarily house people. That's problematic. Can't you think outside of the box and reinvest that into permanent housing? I think you can. The question for me is there political will to do that? So I do think public housing was a true social safety net. It had it. We've proven that it worked. I'm proud of saying in New York that one of our Supreme Court justices, Sonia Sotomayor, came from public housing in the Bronx. Right? Look where she landed. So it's not, we can try to demonize it, but it doesn't always work out when you try. So.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I want to touch on something that the senator mentioned earlier as well. She said more people are becoming homeless every month, right, in California and across the U.S. than are leaving homelessness. And I think we all here know that a big driving factor in that is the criminalization of homelessness. We've seen, especially in recent years across the U.S., lots of policies and practices that are penalizing people for living unhoused rather than actually addressing the root causes of their displacement, right? And so I'm wondering, I'd love to hear from you all about these punitive measures and how you find that they affect the housing crisis.
Well, it exacerbates an ongoing problem, right? People are homeless because they don't have a home. So by criminalizing them, monies that you could be investing in building homes seems to be invested in the penal system, which is problematic because when they come out of penal system, they still need a home, right? So you're back to square one. There's a reluctance in this country to think outside of the box. I'm proud of studying something in Finland called Housing First, which is a model which says give people a clean, affordable, dignified place to live and bring any wraparound services that they might need. And I think it's a way to eradicate the issue in this country. But there's some type of will to not move in that direction. We spend a lot of time in this country trying to fix people versus fixing the problem. So by that I mean, okay, we'll give you shelter that might lead to a home if you come in and you get clean, if you have a drug use problem, a substance use problem, you have to go through this program first. Well, why not do it in the reverse? Helsinki, Finland, a population of 2 million people, has proven to us that housing first works. They basically eradicated homelessness. So, what's the problem, US? Why can't you look outside of the box? Why can't you learn from other places? So, I think part of it is our reluctance to learn from other places and what
I
I
think,
call US.
Rob, I think that's a great point, Rob. But in California, we've been doing housing first for years. And what it means is that the housing first model means that there is no money, there's no state money that goes to projects that require you to be sober first. But the reality is that there's not enough money altogether in order to be moving the needle. And I guess my feeling is that because encampments are so upsetting for the public because they want to use their public park, they want to walk on the streets. They don't, it tears your heart out to see somebody who's literally dying in front of you and you're not able to do anything about it. And it's like, so to me, actually focusing on the encampment problem does potentially drive change. If we're just trying to rely on, our multi-decade problem of like, well, we should help people and do better, which we're not doing. It's like focusing on encampment is saying, sorry, focusing on encampment resolution is saying, let's let the tail wag the dog. Because it's like, if we're saying you can't live here, we're saying, okay, well, where are they going to live? All right,
What's
well, maybe
short term?
we need to build somewhere else for them to live. So to me, it's like actually a good thing because harnessing the outrage of the population, it seems to me like the only way we're going to actually drive the change we need, which means we need more investment, public investment. And in order for that to happen, we have to have an outcry, people saying, we demand this. This is totally unacceptable. We demand change. Because otherwise, it's just the same status quo.
That's right.
Yeah, and if I could just add a couple things. So first off, I completely agree with both the senator as well as Rob that if you criminalize and punish people for homelessness, you're making things harder. And we just are dealing with the aftermath now of the Grants Pass decision, where the Supreme Court held that it is not, it's kind of contrary to our prior precedent, that it's not a violation of a cruel and unusual punishment to punish people for sleeping outside, even when they have no alternative. And actually, Rob mentioned Justice Sotomayor, and she spoke very powerfully. She's like, "Well, then where do you go? Like, is there any place that you can go?" And so I think what we're seeing are these laws that try to make homelessness invisible, but are not really addressing any of the root causes. And not only are not addressing the root causes, are actually being counterproductive. Exactly as Rob said, it's if you're going to have an arrest record, how are you going to be able to get any employment or housing? If you're going to be fined, how are you pay that? You have no money. And if you're unable to pay, that could result in an arrest. And the little money you have, you may need for just day-to-day survival, food, and medicines. And there has been a study in Florida that actually showed that diverting resources to law enforcement may cost 2 or 3 times more than it would to invest in affordable housing. And one of our partners says it very well. He calls the criminalization of homelessness and of life-sustaining activities you have to do somewhere, because we're bodies, you have to do it somewhere, that happen in public, an expensive way to make homelessness worse.
I wanted to jump in and ask a question of the senators, and this may apply to Tamara as well. Given that California, because as Tamara was just saying, talking about the weather conditions and sleeping outside in California, given that California is a draw for people who may live in places that are colder and who don't have options, and California bears the responsibility of suddenly housing more people than people that are drawn there, and you have a homeless problem in Los Angeles, and you have a housing problem in San Francisco that have risen uh, to alarming levels. What is the responsibility from your perspective as a representative from California of other states for people who migrate to California, but who blame California for this issue? How does that play? Like, what
I
is
mean,
the strategy there for?
yeah. So thanks for that question. It really is a misconception that people are traveling around to be homeless in a different place. And that's true for the city. People go homeless in the communities that they live. And the studies are unequivocal on this. It really is the vast, vast majority of people have connections to that place. It may be that they went to school there, they raised their family there, they go to the beach, they're whatever the different, it's their faith community. It's everything that draws people places in the first place: work, family, connections, and they don't leave that to go be homeless in Miami if they're from, from somewhere else. But there is, my perspective on this is that, and this comes up when people are talking about going from city to city to be homeless in San Diego County, which I represent San Diego County, and Orange County in the California State Senate, or they're trying to move from Wisconsin to go somewhere. I mean, the reality is most people are from the place where they lived before. That was their last address, and then they became homeless for all the many reasons people do. But also, we all have an obligation to do our part. And that's like, I think of that as in the same way we have a public school system in every state, or we have clean drinking water, or we have paved roads. It's like we should see all of us as having the obligation to do our part and to provide for our unhoused neighbors. And that to me means the continuum of somebody is losing their housing. Where are they going tonight? Where are they in 6 months? Where are they in 6 years? And that whole continuum of, if we can get them, if they are going, they are being evicted, they've gotten divorced, they have a medical bill, they have domestic violence, where are they going tonight? If we can start solving for that, and that's why I think public housing, you have $15 in your pocket, great, come and stay here tonight and let's figure out what you're going to do in 6 months. But it's like we don't have any of those, right? So there's a backlog for that shelter, and it's congregate shelter, and people don't want that. And at every single part of that pipeline, there aren't enough spaces, and we don't make it easy. So you have to have a driver's license, and you have to fill out forms, and all these things lead to people to be unsheltered homeless because there are just so many barriers at every level, and we put the burden back on the individual person instead of having a systems level approach to solving it. And I really think we have to look at all other social safety net programs and just what does the government provide. To me, it's a radical rethinking of how we deal with housing. But given our economic realities, there's just no other way we're going to be able to get out of this. The nonprofit sector is not going to save us. We're not going to be able to get out of it otherwise. And in the meantime, we're living with something that's becoming more and more like a third world country, where we have shanty towns and then we have really rich gated communities. And it's like, is that the world we want? And I feel like in California, that's not the state I want. But it's a super Democrat majority state, and we still have that happening. So like, it is very, very hard to make progress here.
I want to give you a little inside baseball if I could. So I shared early on before we came on air, that I have a connection to Miami. I spent 2.5 years on the streets of Miami. And as I was on those streets, I would constantly hear from people that, it's okay here. The weather's okay. For me, it wasn't. The sun beaming down on me 24 hours a day, or however long the sun beamed on me, I said, I can't withstand these elements. So I don't see a good answer. I don't see people moving for the most part. I can tell you that didn't interest me. But I think the senator just brought up something that's very interesting to me, and that's how we think about this issue. We have to look through a different lens, right? So when I travel around the country and travel around the world and I talk about the 600 shelters in New York, you see eyes light up. But when I tell you the length of stay in a New York City shelter is 2 years, it's problematic. And that's what brought me to this work. I was only in a New York City shelter for 10 months after I left Miami. And I said, this is problematic. You should only be there 30 days, alluding to what the senator was touching on, right? Before we find a solution to your problem. But fundamentally, if we were to take a step back and look at this problem, the problem is poverty, one, right, which has never been addressed in this country. Both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King took bullets going to the UN to address this issue. And then I think the ongoing problem is housing costs far outweigh wages in this country. People just can't afford it in certain areas. California and New York are perfect examples of that. The Bay Area and LA and New York City are perfect examples of that. So what kind of solutions can we figure out as a community and across geographic regions? Because there are some small municipalities in this country that are doing a good job with respect to this. But when you get a city like New York that has sort of an attitude that continually tells HUD or Housing and Urban Development, we're different. We have to handle this problem different. What does different mean? Pouring $3 billion in a hole every year after year after year, and the numbers keep going up. So it's, we haven't come up with viable solutions. And I'll just say this before I kind of zip it up. We had a chief housing officer who resigned recently in the current administration of Adams. And she was the first chief housing officer, a person in that position, to match the two issues. What I mean by that is housing and homelessness. She came out with a blueprint for homelessness and housing. Every other administration had a separate solution for homelessness and a separate solution for housing. Made no sense. It made no sense. You're homeless because you don't have housing. Put the two together. It doesn't seem that difficult.
I can come in a little bit about potential solutions.
Yeah, actually, this again segues perfectly into another question, because I know we're talking about, New York may think it's different, or California, and we have across the US, right? We have so many different cities and towns and states, and it's hard to get people to work together. And it's like, how do we find a solution when all of these environments are so dynamic and so different? And so how can we leverage, both local and national and even international models? I know earlier Rob mentioned the housing first model that's been used in Finland, but how do we kind of leverage all of these different models to create systemic change in a country where we have such diversity in size and environment, et cetera?
I could maybe get started here. I'll say just a few things. I'll say that it's not it's not an easy like one solution. You need a whole host of different policies, and I think some of the policies mentioned, and I'll just maybe lift up some of those policies mentioned. So, for instance, shelter as a pathway to permanent housing. So you need to both invest in temporary emergency shelters. We need that, but also some path to long-term permanent housing. Public housing, that's important. A lot of the issues around affordability. So the rule of thumb should be that housing costs should not be over 30% of a monthly income. If it is over 30%, then you're one event away from losing your home. And that may require things like raising the minimum wage or incentivizing development of affordable housing. That's an issue we're looking at in Florida for sure, about like what can public or private companies do in contributing to lower and affordable housing. And community solutions could be like community land trust, subsidized housing, tax credits, and those may differ community from community. We actually had a clinic project. I teach in the Human Rights Clinic at the University of Miami in the School of Law, and we had a clinic project doing kind of a comparative of just pulling out different examples, looking at the different 7 dimensions of the right to housing and seeing where are there, positive examples. Another thing I want to highlight, which I think is really important, is tenants' protections. So if you have strong tenant protections, that can be very helpful in order to avoid homelessness and prevent housing insecurity. So we've seen, one of the things that we've seen in the last decade is the rise of a right to counsel movement and having tenants protected. So when they go to court in an eviction case, when you go to court, you'll have a lawyer. Just like the landlord has a lawyer, the tenant have a lawyer. And it's been studied in place after place that has these protections. It makes an enormous difference. So, for instance, I was just looking at a study in New York City that eviction rates have decreased by a quarter since there's a recognition of right to counsel. And 84% of represented tenants are able to stay in their home. And those that are not able to stay in the home, many can have at least more time in their home before they're kicked out to find a place. So I think all of these are some of the things that we need for real solutions.
Yeah, I think I would just jump in here that Tamar mentioned a lot of really good policies, and some of them are, they're being worked on incrementally, like more investments in affordable housing and more money for projects that utilize tax credits and other incentives, and an easier path to build higher density projects, which are more naturally affordable. And I think preservation of existing affordable units is also really important, because we do have a system where a lot of the naturally affordable housing gets torn down to build something that is new and is more profitable. And just fundamentally, because the private market builds most housing. It is, we kind of get into we repeat the same thing again and again. Unfortunately, when building housing costs a door, you're spending 750,000 to get one door open. It's very difficult. That's to me why the really complex system we have is it's going to be very hard to do at scale. And that's why I go back to saying where I started, which is that we need public housing. And we also we need the federal government. I think the very biggest thing that would make the biggest difference is a prioritizing of this at the federal government level. And unfortunately, during Biden's term, I was really happy with a lot of the things that happened, like the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides a lot of money for infrastructure and climate projects. Those are really important, but we didn't meaningfully deal with homelessness in that 4-year term. The number of Section 8 vouchers that are available and the number of landlords that accept them, and even a project-based Section 8 voucher program where a whole complex could be built around accepting the Section 8 voucher, that kind of thing could make a big difference as well. But we have major problems around siting of any type of homeless facility. I see this in the city of San Diego, seventh largest city in the entire nation, and we can't find a place to open a shelter. And it's like, we have many that are open and there are beds and this and that, but we need so many more. And every single thing is a neighborhood fight, and every process is just it's so laborious and difficult that it ends up not happening. So eliminating some of these barriers to how we get things cited, and then having a federal investment in it, to me that's really the only way we're going to meaningfully change things, because otherwise we're going to continue doing what we're doing, which is very, very small. And I'll also just say one more thing. Poverty, as Rob said, is critical. 50% of people are just poor. The other, though, are mentally ill and drug addicted, and we need to be able to have actual beds for them. We have a critical shortage of that in California. There just are not the beds for people. And so that is the population of homelessness that's the most upsetting to the public. The mentally ill and drug addicted who are taking off their clothes or defecating or fires and all the different things you see happening in these encampments that you say, like, these people are deeply, deeply sick. And people become sick living on the street. That environment, they might have not been schizophrenic, but like it gets triggered because of the reality of what it means to live on the street, which is horrible. So we need, I think, an approach to all of the different major subsections of homelessness. Veteran homelessness is the only one that's actually going down right now. And that's because of the commitment from the federal government that we haven't seen for other sections of homelessness.
So I want to follow up the senator because I'm deeply involved with the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. And that's exactly it. When they tried with this big umbrella to end homelessness in 10 years, they said this is a struggle. We can't do it. But then somebody wisely under the Obama administration said, let's focus on veterans homelessness and really reduce those numbers. So it was an applied application to really focus on one group. And they've, I'll give the federal government all of its props for doing that. And just so you know, Senator, I've been involved in the continuum of care in New York for about 12 years. So I spent a lot of time working in that particular body. But I think you bring up some dynamite points. It's particularly with respect to construction. There is this profit margin that developers just have to have. And how do we temper that? Because we have all types of programs in New York that says, and I like to call them 80-20 programs. I'll give you a tax incentive, Mr. Developer or Mrs. Developer, if you build a building in this community where you set aside 20% of those apartments for low income, fixed income, or below in certain levels of income people. That's great, but that's a smidgen of what we need. I think the formula needs to be reversed. We need 20/80 buildings, 20% market rate, 80% fixed income. So we have to change that way of thinking. So there's a lot of things that play into this. And finally, I want to talk about, because I think today is exceptional. Our mayor was up in our capital, Albany, today, trying to get the okay to pull people that the city perceives to be mentally ill off the trains and put them in hospitals. I don't have a real solution for you, right? All I'm going to do is increase the amount of Medicaid and Medicare funding that needs to go in the hospitals. How do you take that money and redirect it, right? Folks need help. They need support services. So Put them, use a housing first model. You know they're going to need wraparound services, so bring those services to them. It has to be a priority within our government to do this, and it needs federal government intervention. We have to get the okay from the federal government to do this, and we need to go back to public housing. It was a true social safety net for all of these issues for years.
Yeah, I mean, to your point about the 80/20, what percentage of projects are affordable and which are market rate, because it is the private market providing the housing, they are only going to build what's feasible for them to make a profit. And so, when you have even 15% affordability, which is only, that's not very many units. You're getting, you're getting 85 market rate units and 15 deed restricted affordable units. But in some communities, like the city that I was the mayor of, the city of Encinitas, those were the only affordable units we had. But it meant that the market rate units were ever more expensive because they were subsidizing the lower cost units. But that is how you build housing without public subsidy, is that the upper income is supporting a smaller portion of the deed restricted affordable units. So in a way, it would take, I don't think we're going to say you have to make less profit and have that work. We have to say we have this alternative over here where we're actually buying the land, building the housing, and we're doing it at a reasonable price. I mean, we're doing it at the lowest possible price. But of course, the government is still going to use private industry to build, right? It's like, so we get hung up in California around labor standards. What kind of labor standards build affordable housing, and who works on those projects, and how much are they paid? And so sometimes we see these programs that get enacted by the legislature and they're almost never used because they can't make them pencil. The development community says, with those labor standards, if it's outside San Francisco, it doesn't pencil for us, so we're never going to use the concessions, the waivers, the additional density bonuses, the tax credits, all these things that are given to projects if they agree to do this, to build more affordable units, essentially. So it's like, it's an enormously complex system of all these layers, but at the end of the day, when those projects go all the way through, it's like, what is this costing us per door? And it's
That's
750,000.
right. That's right. And I know that from my work in the continuum of care. But I will say
But
this, Senator, profit, and I'm going to break this down in simple terms. Profit is a drug for developers, and the urge for that drug is never satisfied. More and more and more. I could tell you, our landscape in New York is permeated with vacant market rate apartments that are investment vehicles for people that don't even live here, and it's yeah, it's the
there's
new, we call it the new safe deposit box,
there
right?
should be a vacancy tax. That's what they should be.
There
I
you
mean,
go.
because
There you
then it's like, then it costs you money to keep those
there
open.
you go.
Yeah, really,
What
vacancy
what
tax.
what have you all observed post pandemic with commercial real estate taking such big hits and people not coming to offices anymore? What trends are you seeing? What observations have you made about those properties being turned into residential housing?
Well, what I've noticed or heard is that it's not as easy to do as you'd hope. So, commercial buildings, especially ones that use steel, they're more than 5 stories, that just the way the building is built is not easily turned into housing in terms of the plumbing and the corridors and all the different things. But in California, we have really loosened where housing can be built. So, we had a bill last year or 2 years ago that was YIGB, yes, in God's backyard. So faith community can build housing. Housing can be built in commercial areas and industrial areas, on state property, all these different ideas to say, on school properties, how can we make it so that everybody is building some housing? So, and incrementally over time, this will result in more stock of housing. But the question is, at what scale? The scale that's been the best is accessory dwelling units, because we have a lot of single family homes, we have a lot of suburbs. Having more density that's sprinkled in existing neighborhoods has been one of the most successful housing programs in California in terms of numbers. Like, where are the numbers really coming from?
And in Florida, we've actually seen more and more people move to the state, and in Miami specifically, now that remote work is an option for many people. So our rents have doubled. And I think housing authority is now seen as a mainstream issue that affects everyone. And in fact, we saw our first, Miami has very poor tenants' rights protections, We saw our very first Tenants Bill of Rights passed during this period. However, it was short lived because it was then preempted by state law at Florida. But there is definitely a movement that's developing to look at housing affordability and housing costs post COVID.
So I want to jump in on Lance's question a little bit from the perspective of New York City. I think we still have a problem with vacant commercial buildings. However, we have a bunch of ordinances that stand in the way. Some of the problems are what the senator laid out. Yeah, that exists. But years ago, we took away something in New York City that worked for the most part: single room occupancy spaces. There were people that were happy to live in these spaces and they would share a bathroom and share a kitchen. And you could convert some of those former office buildings into that. But since the city outlawed those dwellings, it makes it difficult. But there is a robust organizing group across different levels through elected officials, appointed officials, people in communities that are really trying to reclaim some of these buildings and make them, particularly in Midtown Manhattan. You guys are familiar with areas like Grand Central. A lot of those areas have vacant buildings, and we're working hard to try to convince folks that we need to change some bills and need to change some ordinances.
And
It takes time. Now, it's a
what,
time-consuming process.
And Rob, why is that? Why would, because single room occupancy rooms are just a critical bottom rung that are so needed, and I didn't realize they're not allowed in New York City anymore. Why is
Yeah,
that?
they
Why is
took it.
that?
They took it away because the real estate lobby said, they're taking up space where we could put up these buildings and again maximize our profit. That's the bottom line. And the elected officials, development is strong in New York. Tish James, our attorney general, was once on stage. We put together this event with the former UN Special Rapporteur, uh, Raquel Rolnick, and she made this opening statement. Development is to New York as oil is to Texas, right? So developers dictate what happens in New York City. And sometimes, if you just, somebody like me who was studying this stuff and trying to observe what the problem is, you look at something like Hudson Yards, which we're so proud of as a city, but juxtaposed 2 blocks away to a soup kitchen that serves 2,500 meals in a 2 hour period every day, right? So we have poverty and wealth existing side by side, the haves and the have nots, which exist all over the country. But it gets back to that poverty issue, Senator, that we were talking about. But the issue with the single room occupancy, that's what we're fighting. Some of us are fighting to bring back because it's just such low hanging fruit and you could pull so many people inside if you would just change those rules, right? It,
Yeah,
they
you know, I,
existed and they were functioning for so long in this city.
Yeah, I went to college in Chicago. I went to Northwestern, and we recently took our kids back. We have teenagers, and we were just doing college touring, and we were in Chicago, which I haven't been in years. And the only homeless person I saw was a guy with a sign that said SRO equals $17, and I was thinking like. We don't have that in California. Like in San Diego, you can't pay $17 and stay in a hotel room for the night. But I was really, and I was reading a book, "Housing is a homelessness is a housing
It
problem."
has a problem.
Yeah, and they have a section on Chicago that's like actually says this exact thing, like that there's more affordable housing, there's more naturally affordable housing, and that you can access a 17 room SRO. I really feel like that needs to be part of the solution, and there's no paperwork required. It's not requiring ongoing oversight with caseworkers. There are sometimes people who just need to be able to go somewhere, and they have $17. So I really feel like we need to be talking more about that, and I'm glad to hear there's an advocacy group that's sprung up in New York that wants to deal with that.
Yeah, yeah,
And,
that
and
makes
also
sense.
the issue you raised, Senator, about zoning, where zoning for single family homes sometimes is so restrictive that it's very hard to have an addition for, could be for older children or could be for grandparents or older parents. And even that can be problematic. And I think just being able to have, there's an article I read called The Missing Middle, that we have either high rises or single family homes, and we need something in the middle that allows for greater density. I think that could be an important part of the solution as well.
So, Tamar, part of that is what I call American exceptionalism, right? We've absorbed narratives that home ownership is the way you're supposed to live. It's a great life. Tamar, you've heard from me. Taylor, I'm sure when you were a student, you heard me say, I don't care about owning a home. I want no parts of a home, because it's a myth when they tell you that it leads to wealth. It might lead to some stability, right? But it doesn't lead to wealth. But we've all absorbed that narrative, and people struggle to their grave trying to own a home. When in fact, if they learn to share property, their lives would have been much better, right? That's a fundamental problem. How do we get at the core of people, right? I always ask the Marxist theorist in New York who teaches at the CUNY Grad Center, David Harvey, uh, how do we aren't we complicit in our own problems, is the way I like to phrase it, right? We're complicit, right? Because we've absorbed these narratives and we can't think differently. We can't think about shared ownership. We can't think about cooperatives. And then again, we also have to have a conversation, which we didn't touch on too much in this conversation, of land, the price of land and how land skyrockets. That's what leads back to what the senator says. It costs you $750,000 to move a person in because the price of land is so high, right? It's just
I completely agree with you, Rob, that we have a fixation on home ownership that to me is really unwarranted, but it's repeated again and again. But I think about my dad, who never liked maintenance. He lost home foreclosure. He moved around, and it was just like, and he was a great dad and a great provider and did all the things, right? Worked and all, married, all the things. But it's like, why is it that we think that he should have owned homes or multiple homes? It just seems to me like we are able to build a meaningful life, to be able to participate in your community, to take care of your property, some of these other things that home ownership supposedly brings to the collective, not just the individual. And I think we can get those values also out of different models, like you're saying. But it is interesting how much that narrative of like, we have to provide more opportunities. Even now, there's a real push in California for middle income first time home ownership.
that's right. That's right.
To me,
Yeah,
that's like just not the priority. My priority is street homelessness and people who are living without a home. Like, I feel like we should be singularly focused on this humanitarian crisis that we see on our streets. Not if somebody is able to live. I want people to be able to move up and to be able, to have a opportunity, upward mobility. But just the fixation on like ownership, to me, that's really misplaced.
No, I resonate with this so much, what you both are saying, because it's an absolute fixation. It's like the American ideal that you're taught to want from being a very young child. As myself, someone who's nearing 30, and it's, when are you going to buy a home? Am I ever going to be able to buy a home? And coming from parents who never owned homes, we had our home, at one point we had our home foreclosed, and they're both, very happy living in their apartments. We're wonderful providers. I had a great childhood. And still, even I see with my own father, who is in an apartment now, and, he's always not pressuring, but, pushing me to save for a home and whatnot. And it's like, why? This doesn't need to be the priority here. There are other things, again, solving this housing crisis, people who don't have, any sort of stable home at all, rather than worrying about those of us who are housed but maybe don't own, a 3-bedroom, facility. So
that's right.
So with that, I know that Senator, you have to jump off a little early, so I
I
just wanted to
do.
give
Yes.
you a big thank you again for joining us here today for the conversation. Your contributions were totally invaluable, and
Thank you. And
if you have anything else that you wanted to share before you have to jump off.
well, I mean, I do think that the collective action of demanding that we do better on homelessness and it is critically important. Like, it has to come from the bottom up because we have to demand the change in the accountability and the actual change in the reality on the streets. Like, we have to have people living inside and we have to have our numbers going down each month, and not just we distract ourselves with all this other stuff. Well, we're putting more money into it. We're handing people flyers or Costco snacks. We're, providing a trust so that at some point they might accept housing. Like, all of these things I feel like are distractions. We need to be laser focused on the goal of building places for people to live inside and connecting them to those places and getting them inside. And then those have to be our metrics. So I guess I would just encourage anyone listening to this today and all of us to continue advocating for that, because that is the actual goal. It's not all these other things.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator.
Thank you,
I
Senator.
appreciate your time here.
Thank you.
And on that note, I'd love to hear from you, Tamar, and you, Rob. Any thoughts you have as to, what this advocacy looks like, what individuals can do to go ahead and support this movement? I know that a lot of you have worked in the grassroots space. So what can we do? What can our audience do? What can our listeners do who care about this problem and want to help push solutions forward?
So I think that there's opportunity in connecting with local advocacy groups. So for our work in Miami, we're very closely connected to groups like MCARE, the Miami Coalition on Racial Equity, that focuses on addressing homelessness, and SMASH, that focuses on right to housing. But I know in California, the ACLU of Southern California, that's been a priority issue for a while. And there's a whole coalition of organizations working together on campaigns to end homelessness and recognize the right to housing. So I think there can be opportunities there. Part of it also is about changing the way we think of things. Rob was saying we need to open our minds and think of different solutions. And one of our interesting clinic projects, most of our projects are very legal. We work with a host of different partners on that at different level, international, national, and local. But we also have a project working with artists who have lived experience with being unhoused in Chicago. And the artists are developing artwork. They meet with our students and with advocates from around the US, including Rob was involved in this as well, on the 7 dimensions of the international human right to housing. And then they develop artwork that illustrate these dimensions in powerful, concrete ways connected to community experiences. And all of that artwork is then available for use, for download and use in advocacy. So I think that art may play a role in shifting our vision and developing a larger vision. I want to also come back to something we were mentioning earlier about the need for systemic solutions. It's not about fixing broken people, but about fixing broken systems. And so I think that really needs to be our focus. And then finally, I just want to say that both Rob and I are members of the Human Rights Cities Alliance, the U.S. Human Rights Cities Alliance, and they have this interesting metaphor of a sandwich. And they're saying, if you want change, there should be a groundswell and from the bottom. We really need to have grassroots voices, but we also want to have an international spotlight on issues and looking outside of the U.S. I actually feel like there's a lot we can learn from global struggles. And for me, that's something that's been very heartening, particularly now, to really connect with advocates from different countries and around the world. So the U.S. is up for review, universal periodic review in November, and this is an issue that many of us that are working in coalition hope to really focus on, and the need for addressing the housing crisis and the need for better solutions for homelessness. Thanks.
Tamar, on that note, when you mentioned that you're seeing great developments coming from other countries, can you give us a couple of examples of things that we could learn from here and scale?
Yeah, so I feel like as we're dealing with increasing narrowing, I would say narrowing of political space for work, I've found it very helpful to be in solidarity with advocates from around the world. And for us, like the question that Taylor started off with, is housing a human right? In many places, that's not a question. The question is, how do you realize that human right? And so I think it's time to advance our conversation, really focus on this next level. And I think there are lessons, because housing is so different, it's such a different issue from country to country. I think there are different lessons from different places. So we already mentioned Finland and housing first programs, but I think there are also lessons for grassroots advocacy, from the very poor that come from South Africa that we can also take to heart. So yes, there are a lot of examples, and from Brazil, and I'll let Paul talk more about that because I know he's been very much involved in some of the advocacy in Brazil.
I think she meant Rob, but I'm forgiving her. But I want to go back to the question that Taylor laid out. And I think the collaboration between academia and grassroots organizing is important. My mentor was a gentleman by the name of Neil Smith, who taught at the City University of New York Graduate Center that always told me practice and theory need to exist side by side. And Tamar's Human Rights Clinic puts that to work. Probably the reason why I'm on this call is because of that practice. I knew Taylor as a student, and here I am still talking about these issues. And I appreciate those kinds of connections. But I want to pick up also on what Tamar laid out about the international work. There are places like Barcelona, Spain, where the mayor is collaborating with the housing movements there, and they have things like the municipalist mandate. We're going to govern by these set of human rights principles. Leilani Farhad, former UN Special Rapporteur, created conversations between grassroots organizations and the European unions. I've been privy to come and be brought into some of those conversations. I couldn't imagine like the U.S. government sitting down with grassroots organizations, having a conversation about housing as a human right. It just doesn't seem realistic here, but I've seen it put to action outside of the U.S. So, yeah, learning from other places around the world is fantastic work going on in places we don't always expect, right? Like, folks in South Africa rising up and taking control of their situation. Yes, housing as a human right is in their constitution. Actualizing is a little bit of a different struggle, but they have that constitution to rely on where they can get in constitutional court and say it's written right here in your constitution. Brazil's constitution says land written post dictatorship says land has to serve a social purpose, a social function, housing people, growing food. These are dynamics. Try to change our constitution here and you created a war, right? So we need to learn to think outside of the box and learn from some of these other places around the world.
Right. And it's funny too, like we were talking about earlier, it's like you look at some of these other countries and housing is a human right there, right? And they're beyond just, is it a human right? It is. And how do we realize it? And there still isn't that push for that, American ideal of, well, everyone needs to own a home. And It's no, everyone needs to be housed.
That's right.
So.
Perfectly. Well said, Taylor. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. And thank you, Tamar. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Lance to close us out here today.
Thank you all. Thank you, Taylor, for putting so much of this together, and thank you, Tamar and Rob and the Senator for that insightful discussion, for bringing your expertise here today. All of you are doing such important work with consequences that seem bound to have more impact on our future than ever before. That concludes the program today. To rewatch this webinar or to see a transcript, go to the Samuel Lawrence Foundation website in the coming days. The website is samuellawrencefoundation.org. To learn more about the critical work all of the participating parties are doing to end homelessness, stay informed about upcoming events and important initiatives, sign up for the newsletters of the Samuel Lawrence Foundation and for Brooklyn Story Lab. That's brooklynstorylab.net. Also, make sure you join us for the next Samuel Lawrence Foundation First Friday series, a reprise of our annual March episode, Women Lead the Way, featuring a panel of esteemed women from around the world next month. Thank you all again for joining us, and see you next time.